When people imagine resistance during the Second World War, they picture sabotage, assassinations, or armed uprisings carried out from a distance. What they rarely imagine is a man volunteering to enter a death camp. Yet that is exactly what Witold Pilecki did. His mission was not only dangerous, it was almost inconceivable. He chose to walk into Auschwitz not as a victim dragged by force, but as an observer, an organizer, and a messenger, trained to survive long enough to tell the world what was happening inside. Pilecki was not reckless. He was methodical. A Polish cavalry officer and member of the underground resistance, he understood that rumors about Auschwitz were circulating, but lacked confirmation. The scale of the atrocities was still unclear, even to Allied intelligence. Pilecki volunteered for capture during a Warsaw roundup in 1940, fully aware that Auschwitz was designed to erase people completely. His objective was not escape. It was endurance, long enough to build a network, gather intelligence, and transmit information from a place meant to produce only silence. Inside the camp, survival itself was resistance. Pilecki learned quickly that strength alone was not enough. Food, connections, and morale mattered more than brute force. Prisoners starved not just from hunger but from despair. It was here that seemingly trivial items took on immense value. Small parcels of food, scraps of paper, whispered messages, these were lifelines. Among them was chocolate smuggled in at great risk, broken into pieces and distributed quietly. In a place designed to strip away humanity, something as simple as chocolate restored a fragment of it. Calories meant survival. Familiar taste meant memory. Memory meant resistance. Pilecki helped organize a clandestine network within Auschwitz that shared food, information, and support. This network recorded executions, selections, and the systematic nature of the killings. Reports were smuggled out through released prisoners and secret channels, reaching the Polish underground and eventually the Allies. These were among the earliest and most detailed eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust. They described gas chambers, mass murder, and the industrial logic of extermination at a time when such claims were still dismissed by some as exaggeration. What makes Pilecki's mission so unsettling is its quiet practicality. There was no cinematic heroism inside Auschwitz. Resistance meant staying alive while others died, choosing who received scarce resources, deciding when to act and when to remain invisible. Chocolate did not save lives by symbolism alone. It provided energy, leverage, and moments of psychological relief that kept people functioning. In an environment where every weakness was punished, these small advantages could mean the difference between living another week or disappearing overnight. After nearly 3 years, Pilecki escaped the camp in 1943, not because his mission was complete, but because he believed further action was needed from the outside. He reported again, urging an Allied attack on Auschwitz, or at least decisive action. Once more, his warnings were acknowledged, but not acted upon. The tragedy of his story is not only what he witnessed, but how limited the response was to what he revealed. Witold Pilecki survived Auschwitz, but survival did not bring safety. After the war, he was arrested by the communist authorities in Poland, tortured and executed in 1948. For decades, his story was suppressed. Yet his legacy endures because it challenges how we think about courage. Pilecki did not fight the enemy from afar. He entered the heart of darkness voluntarily, armed not with weapons, but with discipline, intelligence, and the belief that truth itself could be a weapon. Even something as small as chocolate became, in his hands, a tool of resistance. and a means of saving lives where saving lives was never supposed to be possible. Entering Auschwitz was never meant to be a decision. It was the end point of arrest, transport and disappearance, a place people were sent, not a place they chose. And yet, Witold Pilecki crossed that threshold by choice. This single fact separates his story from almost every other account of the camp. He did not arrive broken and confused by violence. He arrived with intent, carrying a mission into a place designed to erase intention itself. Pilecki's decision was not driven by heroism in the romantic sense. It was born of calculation. By 1940, Auschwitz was already rumoured to be a site of mass suffering, but reliable information was scarce. The Polish underground needed facts, not whispers. Someone had to go inside, build a network, observe the system, and survive long enough to report back. Pilecki understood what this meant. He knew Auschwitz was not a prison meant to be escaped easily, but a machine built to consume people completely. Volunteering did not mean optimism. It meant acceptance of near certain death as a possible outcome. His entry into the camp began with deliberate capture during a German roundup in Warsaw. This moment marked a clean break between normal resistance activity and something unprecedented. Once inside, there would be no control over conditions, no reliable communication, no protection. Identity itself would be stripped away. Pilecki ceased to exist as an officer and became a number subject to starvation, brutality, and arbitrary execution. The mission now depended on one thing only: endurance. Auschwitz immediately tested that endurance. Survival required learning new rules that contradicted ordinary morality. Strength alone was insufficient. Trust was dangerous. Kindness could be fatal if it attracted attention. Pilecki adapted quickly, not by abandoning his purpose, but by shrinking it to fit reality. The mission became incremental. Stay alive today. Observe quietly. Make contact cautiously. Help where possible without being seen. In a system built to isolate prisoners from one another, connection itself became resistance. What distinguished Pilecki was his ability to think beyond himself in an environment that punished selflessness. He helped form an underground network inside the camp, sharing information, food, and limited protection. These were not dramatic acts. They were careful, repetitive, and exhausting. Every contact carried risk. Every shared resource reduced someone else's chances. Yet without such networks, prisoners vanished faster. Resistance in Auschwitz was not about uprising. It was about slowing the process of annihilation. Choosing to enter Auschwitz also meant choosing uncertainty without an exit plan. Pilecki could not know whether his reports would ever reach the outside world, or whether anyone would believe them. The possibility that his sacrifice might achieve nothing was real. That is what makes the choice so stark. He was not guaranteed impact, recognition, or survival. He acted because the absence of knowledge was worse than the risk of death. Silence, he understood, was the camp's greatest ally. Entering Auschwitz by choice was therefore not a single brave moment, but the beginning of a prolonged confrontation with hopelessness. Pilecki's courage was not defined by fearlessness, but by persistence in a place where hope was systematically destroyed. His decision reminds us that resistance does not always look like fighting back. Sometimes it looks like stepping willingly into darkness, carrying nothing but the intention to remember, to report, and, if possible, to keep others alive long enough for the truth to escape. Inside Auschwitz, resistance was supposed to be impossible. The camp was designed not only to imprison bodies, but to isolate minds, to break trust, erase coordination, and reduce every prisoner to an individual struggle for survival. Under those conditions, even speaking to the wrong person could mean death. And yet, Witold Pilecki set out to do something that defied the logic of the camp itself. To build an organised, functioning resistance from within a system engineered to prevent organisation of any kind. Pilecki understood immediately that open defiance was impossible. Survival came first, not as an end, but as a prerequisite. A dead man could not observe, organise, or report. Resistance, therefore, began quietly, almost invisibly. It took the form of careful observation, learning the rhythms of the camp, identifying who held small but crucial positions, and understanding where brutality was predictable and where it was arbitrary. Knowledge was the first weapon, because ignorance was fatal. The network grew slowly and deliberately. Pilecki sought out prisoners who shared not only hatred of the system, but discipline and restraint. Recklessness would destroy everything. Trust was extended in fragments, tested over time, and never given completely. The resistance was structured in small cells so that capture would not expose the whole. Members often did not know the full scope of the organization, only their immediate contacts. This fragmentation was not weakness. It was survival strategy in an environment where torture and informants were constant threats. Food and morale became the lifeblood of the underground. Resistance inside Auschwitz could not rely on weapons or force. It relied on calories, information, and human connection. Smuggled food, sometimes as small as a piece of bread or chocolate, was shared strategically, not sentimentally. Those who were most likely to survive or carry information were supported just enough to stay functional. This was a brutal calculus, but it was necessary. Every act of sharing defied the camp's purpose, which was to turn prisoners against one another. Information flowed alongside food. The resistance documented transports, executions, selections, and the operation of gas chambers. This information was memorized, written in fragments, and passed outward through released prisoners or clandestine channels. These reports became some of the earliest detailed accounts of Auschwitz, reaching the outside world. Inside the camp, the act of recording truth was itself an act of rebellion. The system depended on secrecy. The resistance existed to destroy that secrecy, even if it could not stop the killing directly. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this hidden resistance was its patience. There were discussions of uprising, sabotage, even mass escape. But Pilecki understood the limits imposed by reality. Any premature action would result in immediate annihilation. The network's true mission was endurance and testimony. To exist at all inside Auschwitz, as an organized group with shared purpose, was already a form of victory over a system designed to reduce people to silence. Building a secret resistance inside the camp was therefore not about overthrowing guards or seizing control. It was about preserving agency where none was meant to survive. It was about proving that even in the most controlled environment imaginable, human beings could still cooperate, remember, and resist in ways the architects of terror had not anticipated. Pilecki's network did not defeat Auschwitz, but it ensured that Auschwitz could not remain hidden, and that alone changed history. Inside Auschwitz, knowledge was as dangerous as contraband. Information moved through the camp only at the cost of lives because the system depended on isolation and silence. To expose what was happening meant challenging the camp's most essential defense: secrecy. For Witold Pilecki, smuggling reports to the outside world became the most critical part of his mission, even more urgent than survival itself. If the truth could escape, the camp would no longer exist only as rumour. The process began with observation. Pilecki and the underground network recorded everything they could. Transport arrivals, selections, executions, starvation rations, forced labour routines, and the growing role of mass murder. This information was not gathered dramatically. It was accumulated slowly, piece by piece, through memory and whispered confirmation. Writing anything down inside the camp was dangerous. So much of the reporting relied on memorization. Facts were rehearsed mentally, repeated until they could not be forgotten, because forgetting was as fatal as being caught. Getting the information out was even harder. Prisoners were searched constantly. Random inspections, informants, and brutal punishments meant that any physical document was a liability. Reports had to be reduced to fragments, short notes, coded messages, or verbal accounts passed to prisoners who were being released or transferred. Each messenger carried not just information, but the risk of execution if discovered. The resistance accepted this risk because silence was worse. A truth that never left the camp might as well not exist. The channels themselves were fragile. Messages passed through civilian workers, escaped prisoners, or underground couriers who had to cross occupied territory. Each step added uncertainty. A report might be intercepted, ignored, or dismissed as exaggeration. Pilecki understood this and continued sending information anyway, refining details, adding names, dates, and structure. He knew that repetition mattered. One report could be doubted. Many reports, consistent over time, became harder to dismiss. What made these smuggled reports extraordinary was their clarity. They did not describe vague brutality. They described a system. Gas chambers, mass executions, starvation as policy, and the industrial organization of death were laid out in sober detail. This was not propaganda. It was documentation. The reports were among the earliest comprehensive eyewitness accounts of Auschwitz, reaching the Polish underground and, eventually, Allied intelligence. They forced the outside world to confront the possibility that something unprecedented was happening. Yet the response was limited. The reports were read, discussed, and often believed, but action was slow or non-existent. Strategic priorities, disbelief, and the scale of the claims all worked against immediate intervention. This is one of the most tragic aspects of Pilecki's effort. The truth escaped the camp, but it did not stop the machinery of murder. Still, the failure of response does not diminish the act of reporting. Without those reports, denial would have lasted longer, and memory would have been poorer. Smuggling information out of Auschwitz was therefore not about immediate rescue. It was about historical rupture. It ensured that the camp could not disappear without record. Pilecki's reports turned individual suffering into documented reality, breaking the isolation the camp depended on. In a place built to erase evidence along with lives, the survival of truth itself was a form of resistance, and one that would matter long after the barbed wire was gone. In Auschwitz, food was never just nourishment, it was leverage, time, and sometimes the thin line between life and death. For Witold Pilecki and the underground network he helped build, food became a form of currency more powerful than money had ever been. In a system designed to starve bodies and strip people of agency, even the smallest edible item carried immense strategic weight. Chocolate and bread, objects of ordinary life elsewhere, became tools of survival and resistance inside the camp. Starvation was not a side effect of camp life. It was policy. Rations were calculated to weaken prisoners steadily, keeping them alive just long enough to extract labour before exhaustion or illness. finish the job. In this environment, calories were power. A single extra piece of bread could restore enough strength to survive another work detail. A fragment of chocolate could provide energy, but also something less measurable: clarity, morale, a reminder of the world beyond the wire. Food did not just sustain the body, it sustained the will. Within the camp, informal economies emerged naturally. Prisoners traded whatever they had: buttons, scraps of cloth, favors, information. But food was always the most valuable commodity. Bread could be exchanged for protection, lighter work assignments, or crucial information about selections and inspections. Chocolate, rare and highly prized, carried even greater value. Its concentrated calories made it efficient, and its familiarity carried psychological force. It reminded people that normal life had once existed and might exist again. Pilecki understood this economy instinctively and used it carefully. Food was never distributed randomly or sentimentally. It was allocated where it could have the greatest effect: to those who were sick but recoverable, to those in key positions who could help others, and to messengers who needed strength to carry information. This was not kindness in the conventional sense. It was strategy under conditions where every resource was scarce. Choosing who received food meant choosing who might live long enough to matter. Chocolate played a unique role in this system. Beyond its nutritional value, it functioned as trust. Sharing chocolate created bonds quickly, cutting through suspicion in an environment where trust was dangerous. It could buy silence, cooperation, or loyalty in ways that bread sometimes could not. In a place where cruelty was constant, the act of sharing something associated with comfort and childhood carried emotional power that the camp authorities could not control. These food trades also helped sustain the resistance network itself. By redistributing food strategically, the underground maintained cohesion and purpose. Prisoners supported one another, not just emotionally, but materially. This collective survival directly undermined the camp's goal of isolating individuals and turning them into competitors for survival. Every trade, every shared crust of bread, was a quiet rejection of that logic. Food as currency reveals a deeper truth about resistance in Auschwitz. It was not about dramatic acts of defiance, but about managing scarcity intelligently. Chocolate and bread did not overthrow the system, but they disrupted it in small, cumulative ways. They kept people alive long enough to witness, remember, and report. In a place designed to erase humanity, the careful exchange of food preserved it, one bite at a time. In Auschwitz, survival was never an individual achievement. The camp was engineered to ensure that isolation, hunger, and fear broke any possibility of collective strength. Against this design, Witold Pilecki understood a fundamental truth early on. No one endured alone for long. Survival had to be organized, it had to be shared, and it had to be deliberate. What emerged was not open rebellion, but a fragile system of cooperation, built from the smallest available resources. Shared resources were the backbone of this quiet resistance. Food, information, clothing, medical help, and labor assignments were pooled whenever possible, redistributed according to need rather than chance. This required trust in an environment where trust could be lethal. The camp punished cooperation because cooperation produced resilience. Pilecki's network therefore operated carefully, extending help selectively, ensuring that generosity did not expose the group. Survival was not emotional, it was logistical. Food remained the most critical resource, but it was never treated simply as sustenance. It was managed strategically. A prisoner who received extra bread might regain enough strength to avoid selection. Another might carry information or perform lighter labour that reduced overall losses. Shared food meant shared time, extra days or weeks of life that could be used to support others. In this way, food became an investment in collective survival, not an act of charity. Information flowed alongside physical resources. Knowledge about upcoming selections, dangerous work details, or shifting guard routines could save lives if distributed correctly. Those who had access to such information, often prisoners in administrative or service roles, were supported with food or protection so they could continue functioning. The exchange was subtle and constant. Survival depended on maintaining these human links in a system designed to sever them. Clothing and basic equipment also played a role. Shoes, jackets, or tools were repaired and passed along, extending their usefulness far beyond what the camp intended. A functioning pair of shoes could prevent infection or exhaustion. A hidden tool could ease labour or provide leverage in negotiation. These items were not owned, they circulated. Ownership was a liability. Use was what mattered. What made this system remarkable was its discipline. Resources were not distributed equally, but purposefully. Not everyone could be saved. That brutal reality forced difficult decisions, and Pilecki understood this without illusion. Shared survival did not mean universal survival. It meant slowing the rate of destruction, preserving those who could help preserve others, and ensuring that the network itself remained alive. The camp thrived on randomness. The resistance answered with structure. Organising survival through shared resources did not defeat Auschwitz, but it undermined its logic. The camp sought to turn prisoners into isolated bodies, competing for scraps. The underground replaced that logic with coordination and mutual dependence. Every shared crust of bread, every warning passed quietly. Every repaired garment extended the life of resistance itself. In a place built to erase human connection, organised survival became the most powerful form of defiance, and the reason some lived long enough to ensure the truth escaped the wire. In Auschwitz, resistance did not announce itself with gunfire or banners. It unfolded quietly, minute by minute, under a constant threat of death that made even the smallest action a calculated risk. For Witold Pilecki, daily resistance was not about dramatic defiance, but about maintaining purpose in an environment where survival itself was considered an act of disobedience. The camp was designed to eliminate choice. Resisting it meant reclaiming choice in fragments. Every day began with danger. Roll calls lasted for hours in freezing cold or relentless heat, where a single misstep could result in punishment or execution. Work details drained, strength meant to be conserved. Guards enforced terror unpredictably, ensuring that fear remained constant rather than situational. In this setting, resistance took the form of endurance, standing upright when collapse was expected, remembering names when numbers were meant to replace identity, holding onto routine when chaos was the camp's primary weapon. Small decisions carried enormous weight. Choosing to share food meant risking starvation tomorrow. Choosing to pass information meant risking torture today. Choosing to help a weaker prisoner meant drawing attention that could be fatal. Yet these decisions were made constantly, not out of recklessness, but because refusing them would have meant surrendering to the camp's logic. Resistance was not a single act, it was a continuous refusal to let fear dictate every outcome. Information itself became a daily battlefield. Prisoners watched guards, memorized schedules, tracked changes in procedure, and quietly warned one another. of impending danger. A whispered alert before a selection could save lives. A subtle signal during labour could prevent collapse. This exchange of knowledge required discipline and restraint. Speaking too loudly, trusting the wrong person, or acting too quickly could dismantle everything. Resistance depended on patience as much as courage. Psychological survival was just as important as physical endurance. The camp worked relentlessly to convince prisoners that resistance was meaningless. Daily humiliation, arbitrary violence, and constant loss were meant to erode the will to care. Against this, maintaining purpose became a form of rebellion. Remembering life before the camp. Imagining a future beyond it. Treating others as human beings when the system demanded indifference. These acts could not stop death, but they prevented total surrender. What made daily resistance extraordinary was its normality. There were no clear victories, no visible progress. Losses outweighed gains every day. Yet the persistence of resistance changed the texture of survival. It created moments of solidarity in a place built on isolation. It preserved fragments of dignity in an environment designed to erase it. Under constant threat, resistance became routine. Not because it was easy, but because giving up would have meant becoming exactly what the camp intended. Daily resistance under constant death threat reveals the true scale of courage inside Auschwitz. It was not found in rare uprisings, but in the repetition of choices made with full awareness of the consequences. Pilecki and those around him resisted, not because they believed they would win, but because refusing to resist meant accepting a system that defined them as already dead. In that sense, every day they endured was a victory, quiet, fragile, and profoundly human. Escape from Auschwitz was never meant to happen. The camp was designed as a closed system where people entered and vanished, leaving behind no witnesses and no return. And yet, in April 1943, Witold Pilecki did the unthinkable. He broke free. His escape was not a triumphal ending, but a transition from one form of struggle to another. Leaving the camp did not mean leaving the war. It meant carrying the weight of Auschwitz into a world that still hesitated to believe what it represented. Pilecki's decision to escape was driven by urgency rather than relief. Inside the camp, his resistance network had reached its limits. Surveillance was tightening, informants were increasing, and the risk of total exposure grew daily. More importantly, he had already sent multiple reports describing mass murder, gas chambers, and the industrial nature of extermination. Those reports had reached the outside, but the response was muted. Pilecki concluded that remaining inside the camp no longer increased the chance of intervention. If anything was to change, he would have to act from beyond the wire. The escape itself was a study in patience and calculation. It was carried out not through brute force, but through familiarity with routine and weakness. Pilecki and his companions exploited predictable guard movements, moments of exhaustion, and the complacency bred by terror. Even then, escape did not mean safety. It meant exposure. Once outside, they were hunted men in occupied territory, carrying knowledge that could get them executed by either side if discovered. Survival remained uncertain, but silence was no longer an option. After reaching relative safety, Pilecki reported again, this time in person. He compiled detailed accounts of Auschwitz, emphasizing not only brutality, but scale and intent. These were not emotional pleas. They were structured analyses of a system designed for mass killing. He urged decisive action, including attacks on the camp or its infrastructure. Once again, the information was received. Once again, it did not produce the response he hoped for. Strategic priorities, disbelief, and the overwhelming complexity of the war diluted the impact of his warnings. Undeterred, Pilecki returned to active resistance. He joined the Polish underground in Warsaw, participating in operations that carried their own risks and moral weight. When the Warsaw Uprising erupted in 1944, he fought openly, no longer hidden behind false identities or camp numbers. Capture followed. This time, he was sent not to Auschwitz, but to a prisoner of war camp. Survival, once again, was provisional. The war was ending, but danger remained constant. The greatest tragedy of Pilecki's life unfolded after the war. Poland did not emerge into freedom, but into a new system that viewed independent resistance fighters as threats. Pilecki continued to work against oppression, now under a different regime. In 1947, he was arrested by the communist authorities, tortured, and subjected to a show trial. In 1948, he was executed. The man who had survived Auschwitz did not survive peace. Escape from Auschwitz did not bring closure. It revealed a deeper injustice, that bearing witness does not guarantee protection, and courage does not ensure recognition. Pilecki's continued struggle reminds us that resistance is not defined by a single moment of heroism, but by persistence across changing forms of danger. He escaped the camp, but he never escaped responsibility. His life stands as proof that the fight for truth does not end when one prison is left behind. It simply moves into a different, often darker, arena. When the war ended, Witold Pilecki did not step into freedom. He stepped into a quieter, more treacherous battlefield. The uniforms had changed, the slogans were different, but the machinery of control remained. For men like Pilecki, who had fought one totalitarian system in the open and another in secrecy, peace did not bring relief. It brought suspicion. The end of occupation marked the beginning of betrayal at home. Post-war Poland was not liberated in the way many resistance fighters had imagined. The Nazi enemy was gone, but Soviet-backed authorities quickly moved to consolidate power. Loyalty was no longer measured by sacrifice during the war, but by obedience to a new political order. Independent resistance veterans were seen not as heroes, but as threats, men trained to think, act, and organize outside state control. Pilecki's past, once his greatest strength, became his greatest liability. He understood the danger, yet chose not to flee. After surviving Auschwitz, underground warfare, and open combat, he believed that abandoning his country would mean abandoning the values he had fought for. He continued gathering information, documenting abuses, arrests, and the growing apparatus of repression. Once again, he acted as a witness. And once again, truth itself became the crime. The state did not need his silence quietly. It needed it publicly. Pilecki's arrest was inevitable. The same methods he had observed under Nazi rule, surveillance, informants, intimidation, were now used against him by his own countrymen. Interrogation replaced dialogue. Torture replaced debate. The irony was brutal. A man who'd endured Auschwitz was now accused of treason by a regime that claimed to represent liberation. His loyalty to Poland was redefined as hostility to the state. The trial that followed was not a search for justice, but a performance. Confessions were extracted, evidence manufactured, and verdicts decided in advance. Pilecki was denied the dignity of truth in the very system he had risked everything to expose elsewhere. His wartime heroism was erased from the official narrative, replaced with labels meant to discredit and isolate. Betrayal did not come from enemies. It came from institutions that demanded silence over memory. What makes this betrayal especially painful is its familiarity. History often celebrates resistance during war, but struggles with resistance afterward. Courage that is useful in chaos becomes inconvenient in consolidation. Pilecki's refusal to adapt, to forget, to rewrite, to submit, made him incompatible with the new order. The war had taught him to resist oppression. Peace demanded compliance. He chose resistance again, knowing the cost. His execution in 1948 closed a life defined by moral consistency rather than survival instinct. The man who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz was killed not by occupiers, but by a state claiming legitimacy. For decades, his name was suppressed, his story buried. Yet the betrayal that ended his life ultimately failed to erase his meaning. When his story resurfaced, it exposed a truth more uncomfortable than any battlefield horror: that the end of war does not guarantee justice, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy waits at home. War ends, betrayal begins at home is not just a description of Pilecki's fate. It is a warning about how societies treat those who refuse to exchange a conscience for stability. His life reminds us that resistance does not end with victory, and that moral courage is often punished most severely when the fighting stops. The execution of Witold Pilecki in 1948 was meant to be final, not only in a physical sense, but in memory. The state that killed him did not merely want him dead, it wanted him erased. His trial was staged, his confession forced, and his sentence carried out in secrecy. There were no public acknowledgements, no marked grave, no official record that honoured what he had done. The man who had entered Auschwitz by choice and escaped with the truth was silenced by his own country in peacetime. Pilecki was executed with efficiency and anonymity. A bullet to the back of the head ended a life defined by endurance and moral clarity. His body was buried in an unmarked location. His name removed from public discourse, his actions reclassified as crimes. The regime understood that killing him was not enough. His story had to disappear as well. Memory, after all, is dangerous when it contradicts power. For decades, that erasure worked. Generations grew up without knowing his name. Official histories excluded him. Archives were sealed, and surviving witnesses were intimidated into silence. Pilecki's reports from Auschwitz, among the earliest and most accurate descriptions of the Holocaust, were ignored or suppressed. The world remembered the camp, but not the man who had willingly entered it to warn others. His courage survived only in fragments, passed quietly among families and underground circles. The rediscovery of his legacy came slowly and painfully late. After the fall of communist rule in Poland, archives opened, testimonies resurfaced, and the truth emerged piece by piece. What was uncovered was not just the story of a hero, but the scale of the injustice done to him. A man who had fought 2 totalitarian systems had been destroyed by the second after surviving the first. Rehabilitation came posthumously, long after it could matter to him. When recognition finally arrived, it carried an uncomfortable weight. Honours, monuments, and public apologies could not restore the decades stolen from his name. They could not undo the silence imposed on his family, or the loss of a moral example during years when it was desperately needed. Rediscovery did not feel like triumph. It felt like an admission of failure, that the truth had been known too late, believed too late, and honoured too late. Pilecki's legacy now occupies a difficult space in history. He is celebrated as a symbol of ultimate resistance. Yet his fate exposes how systems treat individuals who refuse to adapt morally. His life challenges comforting narratives about victory and liberation. It shows that evil does not always wear the same uniform, and that courage is often punished most severely after the fighting ends. Execution and a legacy rediscovered too late is not just the story of one man. It is a warning about what happens when societies prioritize stability over truth and obedience over conscience. Pilecki did not live to see his name restored, but the endurance of his story proves something essential: that even when truth is buried, it does not stay buried forever. And when it returns, it forces us to confront not only past crimes, but the cost